Okay, hello and welcome everybody to the Patent Literacy Symposium and this session, Inference More Than Filling the Gaps with Nancy Hennessy. My name is Andrea Bell and I'm joined by my colleague Kim Jenkins. We are excited to facilitate this session for everyone. A few housekeeping items before the session starts. The session is 75 minutes long and will be recorded. The chat feature will be off between participants, but you will be able to chat with us if you have any needs. Please keep your video feature off and mute yourself to eliminate any potential distractions to the presentation. We will have Nancy answer some questions at the end of the session. We would love for you to tweet out or share on social media all you are learning from the symposium. The hashtag for the Patent Literacy Symposium is hashtag PaLitSymposium 2020. And now we would like to introduce you to Nancy Hennessy. She is an experienced teacher, diagnostician, administrator, and literacy consultant. While in public schools, she provided leadership in the development of innovative programming and curriculum development for special needs students, a statewide revision of special education code, and a state-of-the-art professional development program for all educators. She is a former national trainer for language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling. Nancy has delivered keynote addresses, virtual and in-person workshops, and training on topics that include professional development, strategic planning, proficient reading and writing, language literacy connections, and dyslexia. Most recently, she developed a full-day training on dyslexia for North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Nancy co-authored the second edition of Module 6 of Letters, Digging for Meaning, Teaching Text Comprehension, and authored the chapter Working with Word Meaning, Vocabulary Instruction in Multisensory Teaching of Basic Skills, the fourth edition. Her book, A Blueprint for Reading Comprehension, Helping Students Make Meaning, is scheduled for publication in summer 2020. Nancy has held various positions for the International Dyslexia Association, including President and Branch Council Chair. She served on the National Joint Committee for Learning Disabilities and is an honorary member of the Delta Kappa Gamma Society. Nancy is the 2011 recipient of IDA's Margaret Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award and received NCIDA's 2012 June Fly Day Award. Yeah, I didn't get that at the end there. So I want to welcome Nancy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Andrea and Kim. I greatly appreciate all of the support that PaTTAN and all of you have provided. PaTTAN has shown incredible leadership in the area of literacy for a number of years now, and I've had the privilege of working with many of you, including Pam Kastner, who is largely responsible for this symposium. So I'm really honored, and I'm really privileged that I've had the opportunity to interact with so many of you. I also want to take a moment to thank individuals. There's just so many of them, but to thank individuals who have influenced my work over the last several years. And of course, that includes Louisa Moats, that many of you heard speak this morning. She's truly been a mentor, a colleague, and a friend to me in terms of encouraging my own learning. I'm going to talk about other researchers throughout as well, and they've really inspired me to do some of this work in the area of comprehension. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you. I know this has been a stressful time, a busy time for many of us, and I want to thank you for taking the time to participate in this particular session. A very good friend of mine and colleague once said to me, we are the sum of all of our teachers, and I totally believe that, and all of you are my teachers as well. So we're going to talk about inference today, more than filling the gap, and I'm hoping I don't create too much cognitive dissonance for some of you, because we have some traditional views about inference, and then we have some updated views about what inference actually is. So let's get into this, and let's see if we can't explore this from the perspective of what does that title mean? Inference more than filling the gap. Now, I'm hoping you'll have some opportunity, even though we're not in the room together. I wish I were in the room with you, but to engage. And so there is a participant guide, as well as some of the PowerPoint slides that I'll be talking about that I hope will support your engagement throughout. All right. So what is it we're going to be talking about today as we work to literally fill in the gap in terms of our knowledge? And for some of you, I realize this will not be new knowledge. So I hope I'm going to reaffirm for you your knowledge base and perhaps help you elaborate on your skills. For others, perhaps this will be new, and so we'll help you build some knowledge in this particular area. So I will be talking about first and foremost the connection that we can make between inference and reading comprehension. One of the things that I really want to stress throughout is my belief that while we can pull apart the knowledge and skill base, all right, that we need and our students need in order to make meaning from text, that in fact, all of these different processes and skills work in concert with one another and allow for us to make that meaning of text. So we'll make a connection. Then we're going to talk about necessary inferences, and I'll make a connection then to informed instruction with some examples. And this may be a little bit different for some of you in terms of when we think about inference types or when we categorize inferences, we're going to be talking about two basic categories, both local coherence and global coherence inferences. We're also going to be talking about potential obstacles. And not that I wanted to confuse you, but I think you all know, particularly those of you who are teachers, that oftentimes when we design something and we go back and reread, we revise. So potential obstacles is really going to come at the end of this presentation. And more about being an inference informed or attuned educator will come before. So sorry if I caused any confusion, but you could draw little arrows for yourself on your PowerPoint at this point in time. So this is our first poll, and we're going to put a poll up, and I want you to be thinking about this statement: reading comprehension is a static process, all right? And so in a moment, hopefully you'll see the poll. We'll wait a moment, and you'll be replying true or false. And we'll look at the results, but then we'll put the poll to the side, all right? I'm not going to show you the answer or the response. So do we have this poll? And there it is. So why don't you go ahead and respond to it, and then we'll just put it to the side, and we'll revisit it in a few moments. And we'll just give it perhaps just a few more moments, because I can see that many of you have voted, about 67% actually. And I'm just going to go to the next slide while we do this. Okay. All right. And we're almost there. I'm glad so many of you are on with me today. So I'm wondering, Kim or Andra, if we could close the poll now, and if you could just keep track of it so that we can move on to this next slide. All right. And I'm going to take it off my screen. All right, so let's delve into this just a little bit, and let's be thinking about reading comprehension initially and then make the connection to inference. And this is a recent definition or description of reading comprehension in Castle's work, which was delving into our current thinking about reading itself. And I want to take a moment just to highlight those parts of the definition that are underlined here. First of all, it's not a single entity. So often I think we equate reading comprehension with product, a particular product, or a demonstration of understanding. And I think what we all need to continually reflect on is it can't be explained by a unified cognitive model. Have you wondered why we keep saying it's so complex? Why we still don't have all the assessment tools, even the screening tools, progress monitoring tools, because of this complexity, right? And then it's an orchestrated product. And yes, as educators, oftentimes what we do is we focus on the product or the outcome, the way that our students can demonstrate understanding. But the reality is you don't get a product unless you have a quality process. And those processes are really linguistic and cognitive processes. So more and more, my thinking is that we need as educators to be focused on what are the processes? What are those linguistic or language processes? What are the cognitive processes that we need to focus our instruction on? So in fact, we end up with a quality product. And then this operating on text, interacting with background knowledge, features of text, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation. I'm hoping what that brings to mind for you is the fact that we know from research, specifically the RAND Reading Study Group, that there are other dimensions that influence, all right, comprehension. What the reader brings, what the text presents, what the purpose is, what the context is in which reading comprehension occurs. All right. Of course, if we ask that question, what are the language or linguistic processes, what else would pop up or come to mind but our reading rope, which I spoke to yesterday, and I'm sure many, if not all of you are familiar with. So when we begin to think about the reading rope and we begin to think about language processes, you know, how do we get to skilled reading? Well, of course, we need word recognition in place, all right? But what do we need to have in place in order to construct meaning of text? Well, we need to have a set of language processes in place. And Hollis Scarborough has articulated for us what these might be. And of course, our focus for today will be verbal reasoning, AKA inference. But all of these processes and skills work in an interactive way with one another. And I think that's particularly important for us to keep in mind, all right? That's a little clue to the poll, all right? So Kate Kane, another person that I frequently turn to when I think about comprehension, both Kate Kane, Jane Oakhill, speaks beautifully to what comprehension is all about and the difficulties that students might have. And she reminded us in a speech actually at IDA in 2009, and I'm sure this is published in other places as well, that comprehension is an integrative process, right? So that's important for us to keep in mind. It's constructive, right? But it's integrative as well, because we have to take the information that's coming into us and integrate those idea units. And then we have to add to that information, supplement that information with background knowledge. You see the strands of the rope, they're probably popping into your head right now. We have to supplement it with background knowledge in order to get to that underlying meaning that's presented within the text. So I often use this graphic or this visual to represent for educators and really for myself, what's happening in the mind of the reader as the reader is interacting with text. What are those language processes that the reader has to be connected with, delving into? What are those things we need to be thinking about as we develop comprehension capability within our students? And we know that our reader, depicted here in the upper right-hand corner, who's reading a placard on dinosaurs. She's interacting with the text, all right? What is she bringing, all right? And what is the text presenting? Well, the text is certainly presenting with vocabulary, one of the strands of the rope, right? Kate Kane says we have to be able to make meaning of the words. And what about those words when we think about them instructionally? Well, those words are academic vocabulary when we begin to move our students into academic text, when we go beyond the decodable or predictable text, when we go into the text that's age and grade appropriate for them, right? What else? That knowledge of sentences. Here come the language structures, right? So we have to make sense of the syntactic structure. And of course, we know our students have to deal with things like, you know, sentences that have many ideas, that are dense, that are long, different structures. And then they have to think about, and we'll be talking about this today because there's a connection here to inference in sentence comprehension. These cohesive ties and connectives that tie up meaning within and between sentences, integrating background knowledge. And here is really our focus for today, all right? Bringing that schema, bringing that knowledge base that is specific to topic or theme, right? And being able to integrate that so that we can make these inferences both local and global. You've heard me use those terms twice now, right? By the way, text structure is a specialized type of knowledge as well. And so that's why it's here. And what do we want the student to be able to do? We want them to create, to construct this coherent representation of text. I want you to think about that word coherent. We'll visit that more than once today, right? If something is coherent, it's understandable. The ideas hang together in an organized way. So our students work with the words, the meanings, they work with the sentences, that's the surface code, right? They integrate their background knowledge. What's implied in the text by the author, that's the text base. And what we want them to arrive at ultimately is this situation model, right? Which is also called a mental model. It's our overall understanding of text. And each and every one of these language processes, right, are contributing to this ability to do that, okay? In addition, we can be thinking a little bit about some of the cognitive processes as well, the ability to actually identify idea units, integrate those idea units, all right, monitor whether or not they're making sense, elaborate on them with our background knowledge, and then walk away. It's called a macro process. walk away, micro versus macro processes, walk away with this overall understanding. That's the work of Judith Irwin and others. Okay. So how then do we arrive at this construction of a comprehension house? We obviously need a blueprint, all right? And the blueprint, all right, tells us what it is that we need to build and how to go about building. And so we can talk about a foundation, these critical understandings, what we want our students to walk away with. We want our students to be able to monitor so that they gain those critical understandings. We can talk about what the support beams look like, particularly vocabulary and background knowledge, but also all of these other support beams, including levels of understanding, which encompasses the ability to infer, to go deeper into the text. And then, of course, our roof is our reading comprehension. So what does it take for a student, for instance, your student, to work through? This is just one little paragraph from the one and only Ivan, a book that typically we might use with 4th or 5th graders. While I'm speaking, just go ahead and read through that, or I'll just give you a second to do that. So what's happening here with the reader, all right? Well, the reader is working with the words. That's the surface code, right? The words that the author has provided to describe Ivan, right, who is a gorilla, all right, actually describe his domain, okay? But at the same time as you're reading, I'm sure you're bringing forward your knowledge of, all right, animals, gorillas, the domains of animals, and so on. And if we had the full text, we'd be able to walk away with an overall understanding, which has everything to do with the treatment of animals, all right? A big idea. All right, inference playing a critical role. So again, I want you to understand that as we think about comprehension, we want to move from shallow to deep comprehension, right? And we're able to do that through demonstrating different levels of understanding. But to demonstrate those different levels of understanding, we have to know how to use our text. And today we're talking about using our text to make inference, to go deeper into the text, right? But we're also going to be talking about the connection between idea units. So stay tuned on that. All right, so this sums it up, I think. Skilled readers use both language and cognitive processes to integrate successive units of meaning, the surface and the text base. This is necessary for constructing a situation or mental model. This mental representation includes that information explicitly stated as well as what's implied. Guess what? You need inference, right, to get to the implied. The mental model is the reader's overall understanding of the situation. So I want to say to you that these big ideas, these critical understandings that students can take with them, all right, is really a major outcome that we want for our students as they continue to interact with both narrative and informational text. The reader stores this in memory and hopefully accesses it for future application. So I'm going beyond kind of a traditional thinking about just, you know, those demonstrated products and thinking about this in a larger way, in a more global way. Just asking everyone to make certain that they don't have their camera on or either their visual or their audio. Thanks so much. So guess what? Here's poll number 2, and it's exactly the same poll that we had before, all right? And we're going to put it up again, and we're going to see if maybe our responses are the same or if they're different, reading comprehension is a static process. Oh, I'm loving seeing all those falses. Yeah, I'm hoping that the message that you walked away with here, and if you didn't, let me just reiterate for you that this is a very interactive, oh my goodness, right? Someone drawing on the screen? I hope not. This is a very interactive process. This is a very dynamic process. Dynamic from the perspective of the reader, the text, the tasks, the purpose, all interacting as we build that comprehension house. All right. So I think we probably can move on because it looks like the majority of you have voted. And for those of you who are thinking it is a static process, I want you to keep thinking about this as we kind of delve into the topic of inference. All right. All right. So let's move on. And now let's talk about, we said the first thing we talk about was reading comprehension and inference, and be thinking about how inference plays a role along with all these other linguistic and cognitive processes. So you have your participation guide, and I think I have this in your participation guide, but I just want you to think for a moment. You can take a moment to script if you'd like. What comes to mind when I say inference? And I'll just give you a minute to think that over, or either to write just a few words. All right, so I promised that we would talk about inference in a somewhat different way. And I think very often when we think of inference, we immediately think of actually what I used as the title, filling the gaps, right? But I said it's more than filling the gap, all right? So let's take a look at this. What is inference? It's the identification of meaningful relations between the various parts of the text. That should give us all pause, right? So we're talking now about how is it that we understand these relationships within and between sentences, right? The integration of those ideas within and between sentences. Even though the author provides us with the words and the syntax, we have to make some inference in order to understand how idea units are organized and relate to one another. And then the second part of this description should resonate between those parts, what's presented to us, and background knowledge. So this brings us to thinking about inference in a somewhat different way. And really the idea of necessary inferences, not mine, comes from the research and primarily from my reading of Kate Kane and Jane Oakhill and Karsten Elbrow's work, right? So when we think about necessary inferences, we're going to think about them in two ways. We're going to think about local coherence inferences and global coherence inferences. Now, here's a little bit of a lexicon check, right? I want you to think about that word coherence. I gave you a bit of information about this a few moments ago, but why don't you get out your knowledge of roots and even think about this from the perspective of co and HER and ENC. So we've got a root, we've got a prefix, we've got a suffix, and how might we then define this word? Well, we know co means with, and HER means to stick with or together, all right? And of course, ENCE, all right, tells us that this is a noun, right? So when things stick together, when they go together beautifully, we can say they're coherent, that they're understandable, that the ideas that are being presented to us, all right, don't pose a challenge because we can see how they're related and that we have the background knowledge that allows us to understand what's lying below the surface of the text. So a little bit more on it. When the ideas presented in a text stick together, they're linked in a logical and organized manner. When the text is cohesive, The reader understands how those ideas and relationships work together and contribute to understanding. Okay. So a little bit more now on what local coherence inferences are. All right, let's take a moment and just read what's on the screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. All right, so you're getting the sense that we're talking about, we're working with the words and the sentences that the author has provided us with, all right? But what we're trying to do is understand how those ideas are linked to one another, how they go together, right? And the big question is, how do they go together? What is there in the text that gives us some clues? Because we look to the text to give us clues about how these ideas are hanging together, how they are related to one another. And the answer here is cohesive ties. I should say devices. Cohesive ties is a type. So what are cohesive devices? Well, they signal intended relationships. And there's two types that we'll be talking about right now: cohesive ties and connectives, right? And they're both syntactic and semantic, language here, language systems everywhere, that are necessary for bridging. So these are bridging inferences, bridging and integrating information within and between sentences and paragraphs. So let's go a little bit further and let's provide you with some examples. And these you will recognize because of being a proficient reader. It's something that you don't have to think a great deal about. But by the way, some of your students will not think about this unless you call this to their attention, unless you teach them about how we can make this type of inference. So here's a bit of a chart that first of all gives you examples of cohesive ties. And then on the right-hand side, right, gives you an example, well, I should say on the left-hand side, that describes cohesive ties, let me say that describes different types of cohesive ties. And this is not the be-all and end-all list, all right? And on the right-hand side gives you examples from text, right? So pronoun reference. Well, we all know that when we write, we frequently use pronouns. Well, what do we use the pronouns for, right? Well, first of all, we don't want our writing to be repetitious, right? We want it to be interesting, right? But also we want to tie up and be certain that the reader is able to understand, all right, that when I say he, it refers to someone else, right? Either before or after in a particular paragraph or sentence, okay? So we use a pronoun to refer to a word found before or after in the text. So there's your example, right? And when you look at this particular example, Benjamin was telling Thomas Jefferson. Benjamin was telling Thomas Jefferson he was a great man, right? Who's he? And as you read further, who's he again? So in this particular instance, the author of Dear Benjamin Banneker, third grade text for the most part, about a revolutionary and activist, Benjamin Banneker, right? The author uses he to reference back to whom, right? Thomas Jefferson. He was a great man, right? Thomas Jefferson, who's he? Yeah, it's the same one. He owned slaves. All right, the second type of cohesive tie that we can use, substitution or synonyms. Not always exact synonyms, sometimes a phrase, all right, that can substitute in for. So the author replaces a word or a group of words in text. So again, same group of sentences. Benjamin was telling Thomas Jefferson he was a great man. Who's a great man? Oh, Thomas Jefferson. But the Secretary of State did not live according to the promises. Who's the Secretary of State? Oh, Thomas Jefferson. Just keep in mind that the author wants to provide as much information and uses very precise words to do that, all right? How many of your students, if you said to them, who's the Secretary of State, would know it was Thomas Jefferson, unless you had taught them that, in fact, this is what happens within text when authors want to integrate or bridge ideas. And then, of course, there's repetition. You can see the repetition of Jefferson in this particular selection again, right? Same selection. Or ellipsis. Sometimes the author omits one or more words. Jefferson owned slaves who he considered, well, we already know that, property. All right. So What are cohesive ties? Kind of a fancy little word here. They're anaphoric devices, which basically means they take their meaning from another part of the sentence. And you can see that in the examples that we've just provided. What's the other type of cohesive device? All right, so we have cohesive ties. Now we have connectives. Wow, these are going to really look familiar to you because you teach these for the most part as conjunctions and you teach them for writing, right? But the reality is they also signal types of relationships and we need to teach them for reading comprehension at the sentence level. Yes, this relates at the sentence level as well as for writing. And so when we think about connectives, and perhaps you use these categories, these are pretty common categories for conjunctions. Sometimes they're adverbs that fall into under this umbrella. These are pretty common terms. We have additive, temporal, causal, adversative, contrast, conditionality, and we have sets of words that signal specific kinds of relationships. So let's look at these as well, all right? From the perspective of they're signaling logical relationships between parts of sentences, clauses, the sentence itself, and they cue specific types of relationships between events. For example, causal or temporal, time. They consequently provide information on how to integrate information. Okay. So, examples again. During the day, my grandfather made furniture for Mr. Wright, his former master. During, temporal, time. My grandmother remarked that I was too high strung, and if I wasn't careful, I would be lynched before I was 20 years old. Okay, if, conditional. We didn't have any of what they called civil rights back then, so there were no way to protest and nobody to protest to, so is causal, all right? And these are examples from Dear Benjamin Banneker, as well as the story of Rosa Parks, all right? So what to do? What to do as a teacher, all right? You know, how do we go about instructing? And both for local coherence, inferences, and global, the strategies or the activities that we're going to design based on these strategies, the strategies will be the same, the activities will differ, all right? So what does the research tell us? And in each instance, what I'm trying to bring forward to you is what the evidence tells us. We need to use questioning, visual and textual clues, graphic organizers, think alouds, what I call combination combos, all right? And of course, the routines that we're going to use are always explicit and direct in nature. I do, we do, you do. So I wanted to give you an example of that. And so what you see on the left-hand side is just a kind of a general outline of what you as the teacher would need to be able to do in an I do, and then an explanation of what it might sound like. So here we talk about the teacher framing a question. A teacher framing a question, and so we have a description of what a teacher might begin to say to students about the ant and the grasshopper, all right? And here we're going to be focused on Aesop didn't want to use the word grasshopper over and over again, but he wanted to be able to tie up the meanings in the story. So he used pronouns to stand in for the grasshopper, and we're going to talk about some of those words, all right? And then the second thing that the teacher would do would be search for clues and connections and model a think aloud, all right? I need to find all the pronouns that are standing in for the word grasshopper. It is a pronoun. Is it the grasshopper? Is he singing to its heart's content? Who is the you the ant is talking to? Do we mean the grasshopper and his family? And I realize you're not looking at the fable at the moment, but based on the fable itself. And then the teacher making some additional connections. All right, let's all find the pronouns that Aesop used to stand in for the word grasshopper and underline them, okay? So framing a question or a task, searching for clues and connections, and then making that connection out loud, all right, for students. So in many instances, you're using combinations of strategies such as questioning and the searching for clues and some of the visualization, the underlining, for instance, that would help students do this. All right, let's see if we can move on. All right, I also wanted to give you an example of substitutions. All right. So here we have Dear Benjamin Banneker again. You can tell I like this little book. And here we're going to talk about, remember, substitutions or synonyms that stand in for the word Benjamin. So I've identified what the focus is, all right, and I can ask some questions about the fact that I know as this particular author, right, happened to be Andrea Pinkney, all right, as she wrote about this, she used some substitutions for that word Benjamin. Remember, this can be a word or a group of words. And so a reading of it and then thinking through, you know, what the question is to ask, and then showing of evidence, making that connection, right? So in this case, I used arrows, all right? So again, kind of a visual representation, but you know, what are the words here that are substituting in, that are standing in for Benjamin Banneker? And of course, we've got the first Black man, and we've got the only Black man. Now there are pronouns here as well, but that wouldn't be the focus. I mean, we always are systematic in our instruction. We structure our instruction. We give our students practice. And by the way, the practice is within the text that they're reading. This is not in isolation. I'm not saying you can't design something, but that is a separate lesson from the text. But what I am saying is it's very helpful when we use the actual text that the students are reading. All right. Connectives, same thing. This is also a selection then that comes from Benjamin Banneker. And here we would be framing a question. We'd be asking our student to be thinking about connectives, words that signal relationships that have to do with, and in this case, cause. Can you find connectives that are telling us that one thing is connected to another in terms of cause? And of course, we've directly taught those conjunctions, those words that indicate cause. And so as we look at this, of course, what will we be underlining? All right, and I used an underline. You could use a box. I mean, whatever works in terms of a coding system. They were forced to dust the spines on all kinds of volumes they couldn't read because no one had taught them, and because it was illegal for enslaved. So our question could be all about, we're looking for a connective that tells us about the reason why, right, these Black Americans during the time of Benjamin Banneker, right, were dusting the spines rather than reading the books themselves. Okay, can you find a connective, a word that signals there is a reason for this? Okay, all right, you can take just a moment now, go to your participation guide, all right, and take just a moment to think about this particular selection. This is a selection for older students. It comes from Common Lit, Stalin, A Brutal Legacy, more like 8th grade or so. And just take a moment and see if you can go through. Here's the question. Can you find all of the cohesive ties, all right, that connect back to Stalin? In other words, are there pronouns, are there substitutions, all right, within this particular text, right, that are used to tie up meaning, right, that are referencing back to Stalin? So just take a moment, it's in your participation guide, or you can just on the slide, just read through and think about it for a moment. All right, if you can just finish up. So I hope I've got all of them. His youth, his alcoholic, dirt poor father, his, Stalin's, all right, from which he, who escaped? Oh yeah, Stalin. Following whose expulsion? Oh yeah, would be Stalin's, right? Who was the outstanding student? Oh, he was, right? Who's him? And who is the unquestioned boss? So I think we cannot assume that our students at all levels will be able to do this. For some students, this will be more automatic than for others. But many of our students will miss this nuance. They will miss that they have to make this kind of an inference. Again, this is a bridging inference, an inference that allows for them to integrate ideas within and between sentences as they build their way to meaning. Okay. I always like to just quickly say to you that one of the things that I think we all are confronted with is how do we assess whether or not our students are able to actually tap into all those processes, into the different parts of that blueprint, that comprehension house. And I think that we need to be thinking very often the activities that we ask our students to do, the explanations that we give them, then form the basis for informal classroom assessment. And so this is just a very quick snapshot, just a brief look at, how I might think about this if in fact, I've taught them the knowledge that they need in order to make use of, to understand really, and make use of cohesive devices, including ties and connectives, right? So here I have a completion or a closure, and then I have an identification with an explanation. So cohesive ties are important because different types of cohesive ties include, right? And then identification and explanation, underline the connective in the paragraph and explain their meaning. I could do the same thing by saying underline the substitutions, underline the pronoun referent, or any coding system you might be using. So I included for you a quick review. I'm not going to take time for this now because I want to move on to talking to you about global coherence inferences, which probably feel much more like what we typically think of when we think of inferencing. But I did not want for us to overlook the fact that, children begin to inference very early on. They even inference vocabulary meaning. Yeah, all right. And as we begin to teach them about independent word learning strategies, for instance, the use of context and the use of morphology, guess what? Inference plays a role. So inference is kind of, it's there, it's pervasive. But from our perspective today, we're talking about working with those relationships within and between sentences, those local coherence inferences that we have to make as we kind of build toward meaning. Okay, this example happens to come from the story of Ruby Bridges. And if you just take a look at the example at the bottom, we sat there and prayed Ruby would be a good girl. Who's the good girl? Who's she? Whose head is being held high? Who's the credit? And so on. Okay. All right, so again, in your participation guide, we started off by asking you to think about inference, what comes to mind. I'm hoping that maybe for all of you, we've elaborated on this a bit. Again, recognizing some of you have this knowledge base. Well, for some it may be new. So, each time we come together, we should be increasing our own mental model, our own situation model of the topic that we're talking about. We should be making new connections for ourselves. So you can script a word or two or just make a note. I'm hoping you're making notes as we're working our way through. And I'm going to move us in just a moment on, so I'll give you a moment. All right, let's move to global coherence inference. Remember I said that we were going to talk about two necessary types of inferences. This is the other one, right? Global coherence inferences are used to fill in the details not explicitly stated. So here's the gap filling, okay? These are specifically about filling in the gap. Needed to do what? To construct a globally coherent representation of text meaning. For example, inferences about themes, morals, settings. I mean, we make inferences about lots of different things within both narrative and informational text based on being able to fill in the gaps, use our background knowledge. So these are very dependent upon this ability to access and activate knowledge networks. And we know more and more knowledge has come to the fore in terms of being important for comprehension. In fact, for some, comprehension equates to knowledge, right? That's important for us, I think, to keep in mind. So Oak Hill and Kane, you can tell I'm a big fan. In order to construct a mental model, we already saw part of this. They need to integrate the information from sentences. We did that. And now incorporate the background knowledge and ideas, right? And where is that? That's in our long-term memory. That's what we store and hopefully have, so we can activate and then use, make connections to what it is that we're reading. So what do we use global inferences for? Oftentimes when I ask teachers to talk to me about inference, what they will do is they'll surface things like, well, inference is about prediction, or inference is about identifying cause. And yes, those are different, almost like subtypes of inferences, but they kind of fall under this greater umbrella of global inferencing. So we can use this ability, all right, our processes and our skills in this particular area for different reasons, for different outcomes. So to understand the cause of events, to predict future actions, to identify setting. Just go back for a moment to that very small paragraph that I gave you, small example from the one and only Ivan. We could talk more about, what do we know about that setting if we kept reading? Identify motives, beliefs, traits, relationships, draw conclusions, understands author's view or biases. And I'm sure you could add some additional ones as well. I thought I'd give you some examples. All right, so here's one, and you can see frog goes to dinner, all right? As I said a few moments ago, very young children make inference. So who do you think the frog brought to dinner and why? And just using a picture. We can use pictures later on as well. We'll see that in a moment. We can draw some conclusions, all right? I think the little guy brought him, and he's a little surprised that he jumped onto the tray. We can identify setting. I just mentioned this. Where's the gorilla? How do you know, right? Well, he's talking about a domain, right? Usually gorillas are caged and so on. And he actually talks about his fellow animals who happen to be in a zoo in a mall. Not so nice. All right, we also can use it for understanding cause, and you'll probably see this again a bit later. This is an excerpt from that Stalin, a Brutal Legacy. And we could ask the question, why was Stalin so fearful? And we can read through this and bring forward what we know about bullies, for instance. All right, and how people might react to bullies. All right, so let's talk then about the fact that if we in fact have to make these global inferences, we have to integrate our background knowledge. What should we know as an inference attuned or an informed inference educator, right? And note that those strategies or activities are basically the same, but they translate in a different way because, of course, our goal or our objective is different. We're not just bridging now, all right? What we're doing is filling in gaps. So I do, we do, you do, explicit instruction again. And so here's an example of some steps that a teacher might take, similar to I can try to outline some thinking out loud for you about what would happen for local, well now for global, all right? And I've included the student part. So the teacher needs to identify and prepare the text or the picture, right? Needs to, again, frame an inferential question or prompt. Needs, again, to model identification of clues and integration of background knowledge this time, and then model response to the questions or the prompts. So that left-hand side is the I do. In between, we've got that we do, we're gonna do it together, and then we've got the you do. What's the student do? All right, if it's a we do, they're doing it with us. If it's a you do, they're doing it. They read the text or the picture, they read and use the questions, they find the clues and connect to background knowledge, and then they respond to the questions and prompts, all right? So I wanted to give you an example of that. And again, I'm going to use the story of Ruby Bridges. And in this case, I identified and prepared the text. We always have to prepare a text. And again, I'm using the text that the students are reading from. Happens to be the story of Ruby Bridges. I'm sure many of you are familiar. This happens to be embedded within a unit on activism. It's pretty relevant right now, actually, but I've used this for a while, all right? And what I have done here is to frame my inferential question or task, I've actually used pictures, right? And so I'm talking about the pictures, I'm talking about them being connected to the story of Rosa Parks. I'm asking them to think about what they were noticing about the pictures, the passenger on the first bus, all right, who's sitting in the rear of the bus, all right? The person in the second picture is Rosa Parks. Where is she sitting and why, right? So then I have to model the clues. Well, in the first picture, the people in the back of the bus are all African American. I know they had segregation laws in the South in the 1950s, Jim Crow. African Americans did not have the same rights as white people. For example, they had to sit behind white people on public buses. But in the second picture, Rosa is sitting in front of a white passenger. So what am I thinking about? Where can I go with this? How can I use those pictures to bridge what I'm reading about, what my teacher is talking to me about, and what I think is going on here to make an inference? I think she's doing this purposefully and protesting a law that she does not feel is fair. I think she must have been protesting for her civil rights. Now I need background knowledge, and let me just say this clearly. You can teach, I've said this more than once to people, you can teach strategies till the cows come home, but if your kids don't have background knowledge, they're not going to be able to make inference, right? So this is absolutely critical, all right, in terms of working whether with pictures or with text, right? And you have to find ways to activate, assess, and if necessary, build, right? Be specific to your text when, in fact, you're asking students to make inference. Here's just another way of thinking about that. Remember when I talked about combination combos? So, you know, you can use questions, you can use visuals, you can use a combination of things. And so this is based on the work of Karsten Elpro, looking at the fact that so many of our students may have the knowledge, not all of them do, but so many do, but they don't activate it. So how do we support that? And we can use a scaffolded organizer, and we can, again, pull the question, why do you think Benjamin Banneker wrote to Thomas Jefferson? Now let's go to the book. What's the book say? Let's pull some information. So I'm modeling, I'm teaching. Jefferson signed the Declaration of Independence. Most Black men and women were enslaved in the late 1700s. Jefferson owned slaves. Banneker was an abolitionist. Pretty brave guy, let me tell you. All right, here's what I know. He was a free man, the son of a slave. You know, I've read about this. I'm bringing forward my background knowledge. We've talked about this. All right. He accomplished many things, including writing an almanac, predicting a solar eclipse. But others like him had very little opportunity. Jefferson, with others, had written the words, all men are created equal. So what do I think about this? All right. How can I make an inference? Why do I think he wrote? All right. He was angry. He knew he had to do something about it. He knew Jefferson was powerful, but he thought it was the right thing to do, and he knew Jefferson was in a position to do something. All right. Now, I'm not going to take time for this. I was going to give you another turn at this, but I'm watching time, and I know that I have a few more things I want to convey about this. But, you know, if you quickly read through this, and I have already used this example, you know, this is all about the fact that Stalin was a major bully. He had been extremely cruel to his people. If you know about his reign as a dictator, you know that he murdered many, many people, sent many people into exile, and so on. So this is just a small piece of it. And you would bring that background knowledge, and you'd also take from the text as well. Okay. So here's the scaffolded organizer that, if we had a lot of time, we would talk some more about. Again, I want to come to informal assessment because I think that it's always important to be thinking about, are there some things we can do in classroom that help us tap into whether or not our students are getting this? Always thinking about moving from shallow to deep comprehension, and inference is necessary for deep comprehension. So citing some background knowledge and evidence, example, why is Ruby Bridges' action considered revolutionary? I could just give a graphic organizer. It says I know so, all right? Not my idea. Many people out there coming up with very interesting ideas, so you may have seen an iteration of this somewhere else. Example, oh, it should say complete the so column, all right? And then open-ended inferential questions. Why do you think? What will happen next? What did the author want you to understand? And then a retell or a summarization, all right? What was the one and only Ivan about? What did you learn from reading that particular selection, and so on, okay? All right, so there's your review, and I've put it here as a quick read. I believe you have it either on a slide or in your participation guide, and it really is a comparison of the two. Please keep in mind then local inferences, all right, local coherence inferences, the information is provided by the words, the syntax within and between sentences combined. They're text-based, they bridge or link ideas and concepts, they're necessary, and for many students, they're automatic, but not all. And then global needs to be supplemented by world knowledge, all right, specific to the theme or the text. They're knowledge-based, they fill in the gap, they make the text cohere, right? And then you have examples of each. So here comes a poll one more time, all right? A major obstacle to inference is text selection. True or false? Or text type, yeah. So we'll wait a few more minutes. About half of you have voted. It's a little bit of a tricky question. All right, I think in the interest of time, we'll just give this about 10 more seconds. All right, I think maybe you're going to be a little surprised at this answer. So this is actually false, and I'm not going to say that different texts maybe don't present different challenges for students, but even when we think about text difficulty, we're not looking at inferences being a metric, although I can understand why some of you perhaps responded true. Here's the deal. All right, I'm just going to go here. Poor comprehenders, all right, as we know, because many of us have experience, they're less likely to engage in necessary processing, generate fewer correct inferences, may generate the same number but different quality than a more proficient reader. They may not access their background knowledge. That has everything to do with that scaffolded organizer. And they create less coherent representations of text. By the way, not all authors are coherent. Don't quote me on that. All right, but they don't always organize their text. An expository text tends to be, or informational text, a little bit less coherent. So I can understand your true response, but the reality is here are the three major obstacles or challenges to making inference: having the necessary vocabulary and knowledge, setting appropriate standards of coherence, and working memory. And I'm just going to very quickly talk about these. So first, knowledge, all right? The struggling or the novice inferencer may not have sufficient knowledge of content, easily access what they know, or even recognize the need. And we as educators need to know that knowledge is absolutely positively necessary for making inference. And so we have to think about our instructional practices that support the access and activation. So this has everything to do with another part of that blueprint, another part of that comprehension house. You know, all of these things working together in concert, we need to be thinking about what I call the ABCs of background knowledge, right? So that's one. Knowledge needs to be more automatic for our students. Oh, Jimmy, can you tell me something about the Monroe Doctrine? Funny, I didn't think Marilyn knew much about politics. I forgot I left that in, but yeah, that can be a problem. Okay, standards of coherence. Now, this may not be a term that you're familiar with, but I want you to be thinking about comprehension monitoring. The fact that when we, in fact, know what our purpose is, right, we set goals, we monitor our goals, right, We adjust if needs be so that ultimately we accomplish our goals. In other words, we monitor our comprehension. So good comprehenders are very sensitive to understanding, what do I have to do? What's the goal I have to set to accomplish this task? What level of understanding do I need to address in order to answer this particular question, or to demonstrate my understanding or create this product, right? They recognize that multiple inferences can be generated, but focus on those that are essential to purpose. What am I being asked to do? What's my goal? And while inference making is often automatic, the skilled reader will note speed bumps. So this has everything to do with our helping our students become very much aware of what the expectations are, what the purpose are, how to set the goals, and how to get there. Develop the processes and skills, model for them, right? Do the I do, we do, you do, right? And then last but not least, memory. And of course, many of us have students who have difficulty with memory, all right? And we know that for local coherence, for those integrating or bridging inferences, they have to hold on to idea units. So they have to be able to understand them. This goes right back to that strand of the rope that has to do with sentence comprehension, word meaning, sentence comprehension. Needs to be automatic. When we talk about automaticity, you're not just talking about word recognition here. Access to. And they have to easily access this background knowledge. This is why it's so important that as we think about text, we think about what's critical to the text. You know, you can't teach them everything about activism or revolutionaries, for instance, for dear Benjamin Banneker, but what's critical to the text. And this then connects to the fact that capacity matters. So weaknesses in working memory can result in inadequate inference making and also affect comprehension monitoring. So working toward making all of these language processes and skills, all right, getting them to work in concert with one another so that students can in fact access and activate what it is that they need. All right, so we come back to, I'm actually going to finish a few minutes early, maybe. We come back to this comprehension house, all right? Constructing the, didn't mean to go ahead. Constructing the comprehension house. So thinking about the fact that reading comprehension is dynamic. It involves the read of the text, the task, the purpose, right? That in order to move from shallow to deep comprehension, in order to move from the surface to the mental model, right? We need to develop and build a strong house. And we need to be thinking about the processes and skills that go into the building of that house. So foundational, what do we want our students to learn? What do we want them to take away with? Can we teach them how to monitor comprehension? We need to teach them some of these support beams, how to deal with vocabulary, all right? Develop word meaning, breadth and depth. Develop background knowledge, the storehouse for them. Teach them how to work with the text structures, teach them how to work with sentence comprehension, teach them how to work with these different levels of understanding so that they in fact can construct reading comprehension. So these are all interactive and working together. You know, if I pulled one of those support beams out, my house would be in trouble. So I wanted to leave you with the thought that comprehension really requires kind of a master plan. Right, and this is the blueprint for reading comprehension that I've developed and that I've been working on for a long time. And it's based in the evidence, it's based in the reading rope, it's based in the work of people like Kate Kane and Jane Oakhill and so on. All right, and what it does is it provides a way of organizing up your instruction as you approach text. So I can't talk about this in detail, but I've touched upon almost all of these aspects. And the one that we focused on today, all the way down, levels of understanding and inference, how will you teach your students to construct meaning at different levels of understanding, including the surface code, the text base, the mental model? How will you directly teach students to use inference to integrate ideas and connect background knowledge to the text? How will you support your students' deep comprehension of text? It does take a master plan. We can't do it all right? I talk about this from the perspective of one bite at a time. How do you eat an elephant? I don't like the analogy, but it works. Okay. So here's what we talked about, and we'll see if there's any questions. We talked about reading comprehension and inference. We talked about necessary inferences. We talked about the inference-informed educator and potential obstacles. Remember, I flipped those. All right, and hopefully we've filled the gap. And I'm hoping you've all been struck by enlightening. Maybe you're going to think about inference in just a little different, just a little differently than you have in the past. Okay, we have a couple of minutes left, huh, Kim? And Andra, if anyone has questions.
Yes, okay, thank you, Nancy. We do have a couple questions. One, a participant asks, please restate the thought leaders you referred to. You stated Oak Hill and Kane, but there was a third person. Who was that?
All right, so Karsten Elbrow, all right. Jane Oakhill, Kate Kane, and Karsten Elbrow have a wonderful book on comprehension. I won't get the title exactly right, but it's something like Understanding Reading Comprehension. If you Google, you'll find. Someone I didn't mention who's done a lot of work in the area of inference, and I have cited her a number of times, Amy Elliman, E-L-L-E-M-A-N. She's at Middle Tennessee State University, and she's done quite a bit in the area of inference.
Thank you. Another question. How do you use the phrase cohesive ties with students? Do you introduce them to that vocabulary?
Yeah, it will depend upon the age of the student. So you can talk about words that help thoughts, ideas stick together. You certainly could go with that sticky stuff to begin with, and then go from there. But you know, I'm very much about developing academic vocabulary even in young children. So you could use the term interchangeably so that they would get used to it. I didn't note, but I will be noting as I do my next workshop, the importance of using grade and age appropriate text with your students as you're developing comprehension capabilities. You know, one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is that texts are written in academic language, and our decodables, our predictables serve different purposes, important purposes, but and we can use them for comprehension, certainly. We shouldn't leave that out, but the reality is to develop this kind of deep understanding, we need age and grade appropriate texts. So just going to ask, yeah, okay. She turned off her video. All right, cool.
Another question, is background knowledge synonymous with schema?
In some ways it is, yeah. I actually, in my writing, differentiate between prior knowledge and background knowledge. You know, we have this kind of large pool or storehouse, and then we have information that's very specific to, and I think oftentimes we talk about that as schema. Important that you keep in mind is, as you think about integrating background knowledge, that it's knowledge that is specific to what it is that your student is reading about. I'm very much, again, in favor of not only age and grade appropriate text, but using multiple texts to build that schema or background knowledge.
How do you increase a student's memory when they have difficulty holding on to certain concepts?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Let me answer it from this perspective, that as things become more automatic for students, you're freeing up space in terms of working memory. So always working toward developing these language processes and skills so that they're not effortful, but rather become less effortful and more effortless for their students. You'd have to look at the literature on working memory in terms of thinking through, there are strategies and activities out there, and I'm trying to recall, oh, there's a very nice little book on working memory and a memory that I really can't recall the author at the moment, but if I do, I'll share it with PaTTAN. I've talked about it in the past, yeah.
English learners sometimes do not have the background knowledge to infer topics related to American history, or their background knowledge differs from what is expected. How do you bridge the gap?
Yeah.
What suggestions do you have for the many teachers who have English learners in their classrooms?
Yeah. So again, right on the money here in terms of the fact that English language learners very often do not have the same background knowledge because their culture is different. And I think one of the ways we can address this is by beginning with what they do know about this particular topic in their own culture, and then bridging and seeing where are some of the similarities and differences. So starting with something that they do know and building from that.
Okay. Another person asked that you wrote a book on comprehension. What was the title of that book?
Well, I have written a book on comprehension. It's called The Blueprint for Reading Comprehension, Helping Students Make Meaning from Text, and it will be published late summer, early fall by Brooks Publishing. Thank you for asking me. It's a labor of love, let me tell you. And I'm hoping it'll be very useful for educators. You know, I know you all heard Louisa this morning. She has been my mentor and she started me on this journey, and it has been quite the journey, so.
Okay, let's do one last question. I'm sorry, there are many, but we don't have time to get to all of them. It says, you mentioned the importance of grade or age level text for comprehension, but what about for remedial students? Stick with the age appropriate text or lessen the level?
Yeah, okay. So for students who require remediation or intervention, intensive instruction in terms of word recognition, by all means use decodable text, give them sufficient practice. But while you are developing those word recognition skills, make certain you're developing the language processes and skills that are necessary to work with text. So for little ones, read alouds, shared reading and so on of age and grade appropriate text. For older ones, give them access, use the technology, but absolutely. You know, for some of you who are familiar with the definition of dyslexia, you know that the very last part of that definition references the fact that if in fact students don't have access to text, they may not have started out with language comprehension problems. That's not the hallmark, as Jack Fletcher talked about yesterday, of a dyslexic, but they end up with reading comprehension problems because what happens is they have reduced reading experience and they're not gaining. You know, all of those language processes and skills are growth constructs. We continue over our lifetime to add to our vocabulary, our knowledge of syntax, our background knowledge, and so on. And if you don't have access to age and grade appropriate text, if you're still reading predictable or decodable text, you're going to miss out. All right. Those are great questions. You all did a good job today, asking me kind of tough questions too.
Well, thank you, Nancy, and thank you to all who attended this session. The session was recorded and will be available on the PaTTAN YouTube channel in the near future.